Joining us, MS Now senior Washington reporter and co-host of The Weekend here on MS Now, Eugene Daniels, and MS Now senior legal reporter Lisa Rubin, and MS Now justice and intelligence reporter Ken Dilanian is with us too. Ken, I'll start with you. So Todd Blanche is insisting that this isn't immunity. You've read the order. What is it?
Well, it's not. Some people are perceiving it as immunity forevermore going forward for future tax returns and tax misconduct. That's not what it is. But when she cited that $100 million figure, the Congresswoman, that is, as you said, based on reporting about the potential penalty and interest that the Trump organization was facing from an ongoing and long-running IRS audit that would go away and is going away under this agreement. And in another clip, Todd Blanche was trying to portray this as a routine settlement. People settle with the IRS all the time, and the audits go away, and that's true. But that's not what happened here. They didn't settle on the merits. The IRS didn't decide, well, we're going to compromise, and you pay a certain sum of money, and we drop our claims. Donald Trump's lawsuit was entirely unrelated to the merits of whether he took a proper tax deduction, and 25 lawyers inside the IRS signed on to a brief that said that there were tons of defenses to this lawsuit. It really had no merit. It wasn't going anywhere because, Donald Trump's tax returns were leaked by a contractor who's now in prison. That's happened to other people before. They have not been able to make claims. You can't sue essentially the federal government based on the misconduct of an individual contractor or employee. That's essentially the law. So the lawsuit was meritless, but Donald Trump's former defense attorney, who, as the Congresswoman said, was paid millions and millions of dollars to defend Trump in all of these various investigations, is now the acting attorney general. He signed on to this document, and unlike the slush fund, it is still in place. Now, I firmly believe that if a Democrat is elected to the next as the next president, that administration would, of course, review this and look at its options about whether they can withdraw from this agreement, and may have good grounds to do so. So it's not clear that this will last forever. But for now, this IRS action and audit, which is long running, again, Trump has acknowledged it, it goes away, and any potential penalty goes along with it.
Lisa, where do you see things standing legally right now, since a judge revived the lawsuit and raised some serious concerns about how all of this unfolded in the first place?
Well, let me be picky-unish for a second. The judge hasn't yet reopened the lawsuit. What she has said is that she is considering reopening the lawsuit, wants to hear from Trump about whether or not there was collusion in not only the development of the lawsuit, but in how it ended. In terms of the legality of what the order is, what Todd Blanche characterized yesterday as an order and not an addendum to the settlement, there are any number of reasons why one would think that an order from the Attorney General is not satisfactory to end tax-related liability for an individual person, starting with the fact that under Department of Justice policy dating back to the 1930s, the Attorney General cannot settle something that hasn't yet been referred to the Department of Justice for prosecution or defense. Because the audit itself was not the subject of litigation, nor do we believe anybody ever referred it to the Department of Justice, it's not even clear to me that Todd Blanche had the authority to enter into this release, whether or not narrowly crafted or as broad as it is. But then there's a separate problem. He is right to say the IRS enters into settlements with individual taxpayers all the time. But that is through something called a closing agreement, which is signed by the IRS and the taxpayer, not sort of by fiat or decree by the acting attorney general. So there are a number of legal problems with this. The other difficulty, though, is who can cure those problems. It's not clear to me, and I wrote a piece about this for MS Now that I encourage our viewers to look at. It's not clear to me that anybody has the right to sue for all of the deficiencies with this Todd Blanche-oriented decree.
Well, there's also the political problem. And yes, to the question of who can cure this political problem, would that not be the responsibility of Congress right now?
I have talked to Democrats who feel like they're going to win the House in November and who are chomping at the bit of the idea of getting into this, especially as they see and continue to see acting Attorney General Todd Blanche act as, in their view, continuing to act as President Trump's personal attorney while he is serving as the people's attorney. And when you talk to Democrats, they are looking for ways to, one, actually provide some accountability for the things that they feel like they've been seeing over the last 2 years, and looking for some political wins, right? They are promising people that they're going to hold folks accountable. They aren't going to be able to pass a lot of bills. Donald Trump isn't going to sign sign a bunch of things that Hakeem Jeffries, if he's speaker, puts on the floor. That's not going to happen. This is the lane that they feel like they can actually do things in and feel like there's a lot of work to do. So whether it is the Oversight Committee or anyone else, whether they create a different committee, because that is something that a Speaker Hakeem Jeffries could do if he is to win, that can happen. And I think one of the things that's so interesting here is you're starting to see Republicans run away from this, because they didn't seem to have, which was strange to me, an issue with the $10 billion lawsuit, right? They thought that the courts will handle that and won't have to be a thing. And that's about Trump, and that's who he is. But then the idea that people who beat cops on January 6th could have access to taxpayer dollars while they are running...
cops, but also actually threaten some of their own lives.
Yes.
That might be the difference. It was a little personal.
On the floor, scared for their own lives, thinking they were going to get killed that day. And so they are upset about that. He hasn't given them anything to run on, really, for the midterm. And it's making it harder for them to do their job. And so that's where you're starting to see some of these Republicans, especially in swing districts or swing states, or people who Donald Trump has knocked out of a primary, who are saying, you know what, I'm actually fine with just countering him on this one thing.
Well, you know, they have the route of committees and investigations and the sort of post-midterms landscape working for them. But I think one of the open questions for me is around the sort of responsibility politicians have to also do the storytelling and explaining to their voters, to the American people about what's happening. And do you think they've been effective enough on that front to, you know, on connecting the dots here, the sort of larger Trump corruption story, the accusations of self-dealing, and the way in which taxpayer money has been looped in with all of that?
Some of them, right? I'm thinking about Jon Ossoff, for example, in Georgia, who has been kind of a leading voice on this, and not just a voice on the possible corruption, but tying it back to the American people and the voter. And I think that's the difficulty sometimes that all politicians have, which is you talk about the thing, right? You say, you know, Donald Trump is corrupt. That is what they will start with. But then you also have to say who is the victim of that corruption. And I think this $1.776 billion slush fund that it was going to be was a perfect example for a lot of Democrats to say that's your money that he's trying to use. And one of the issues is they're all sometimes kind of all over the place on the messaging, which is midterm. They don't have to have a national message, but being able to tie it to voters being the victims of something and who was the bad guy, quote unquote, is the way to do politics.
Lisa, Blanche was asked if the Department of Justice was going to put their, you know, step away from this fund in writing, if they were going to guarantee it in a document. He did not seem to want to do that.
No,
does it matter
that he's not going to?
He said it. He basically said it doesn't matter. I've said it here, right here to all of you.
And my word should be good to you. He wasn't under oath, but more importantly than that, Antonia, the settlement agreement itself that they are insisting is still valid compels the Attorney General to create this anti-weaponization fund. So if they are insisting that this is a valid settlement agreement entered into, on one hand, by President Trump in his personal capacity and by the Department of Justice and the IRS on the other, then theoretically they still not only have the option to, but the obligation to create this anti-weaponization fund. I don't find that to be a satisfactory answer at all. And of course, the response to that goes right back to Eugene, right? Like, to the extent that nobody can stop this settlement agreement from being in effect, I'm not sure that the judge, for example, who's been asked to reopen this case, could necessarily invalidate this settlement agreement. But you know who could? The Congress could, by saying that no funds from this judgment fund can be put into an account for the anti-weaponization fund, nor can other funds from the judgment fund be sort of expended for the same purpose, meaning they can't be given to individual January 6 defendants to compensate them for perceived lawfare or weaponization, because that's the fear of what's going to happen next. You don't call it an anti-weaponization fund. You don't set up $1.8 billion in a fund specifically for that use, but you allow individual claimants to go to the Department of Justice and say, I'm going to sue you if you don't compensate me. And then the Justice Department does have authority to take funds from that judgment fund and pay individual claimants with threatened litigation.
You think that's a very real possibility?
I think it's absolutely a real possibility. And in order to get political buy-in, they may draw a line about who's eligible and who's not. We won't compensate, for example, somebody who is convicted of assaulting police officers, or we won't compensate people who have been convicted separately of child sex abuse. They may draw those lines, but the very promise not to create an anti-weaponization fund doesn't and the possibility that some people are going to be compensated.
And there's also the concern from a lot of Democrats and some Republicans about making sure that there's a signal to people who might do crime, whether it is hitting police officers or other violent things, in the name of Donald Trump or any other president, to say, actually, you can't do that and then get money from the federal government and taxpayers.